Good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Just in opening, I'd like to say that I live and work on the lands of the Kaurna people, and before we start, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to them as the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we are virtually gathering on today. I acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to the land and cultural beliefs. Our colleagues from the Australian Text Analysis Platform are joining us from another part of Australia, and there may be people beaming in from elsewhere online, so I extend that respect to relevant communities in other regions who are represented here today. Welcome to the second webinar in the 2021 series of the University Library's Digital Humanities Lab. The objective of this series of webinars and in-person events is to showcase digitally innovative work at the University of Adelaide, encourage and inspire researchers and students interested in using digital methods and tools, make them aware of resources that are available to them, support a little bit of peer learning across our community, and facilitate networking that could lead to interdisciplinary collaboration. Over this year, we're presenting a series of webinars on digital methods in the humanities and in-person gatherings for those people who are interested in these approaches. As you have registered for this one, I'll send you notice when future sessions are available for registration. Today, we're talking about text analysis. As more and more sources of data, including historically, socially or culturally significant text, become available, humanities projects and other disciplines are looking at computational methods of uncovering meaning and patterns in those data sets. Think historic newspapers, social media collections, correspondence, and even collections of academic publications. All of these things can be clustered and grouped in ways that offer new insights if we're able to see through those texts. Certain kinds of text analysis are also helping us detect sentiment across large populations, or say predict events, the rise of certain kinds of thinking among the community, or the rising of certain social movements. We'll hear from three speakers today. First up, I'll introduce Ashley Dennis-Henderson, and then I will come back online to introduce the other speakers as we go forward. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a chat icon. Please feel free to ask any questions of the speakers in that chat window. I'll collect those questions and ask them to our speakers at the end of today's presentation. And also feel free to use that chat function to introduce yourself and if you have a special interest in this topic today. So first up, we have Ashley Dennis-Henderson. Ashley completed a Bachelor of Mathematical Science Advanced at the University of Adelaide in 2018 and a Master of Philosophy Applied Maths in 2020. She's presently working on a PhD in Applied Mathematics and a Diploma of Arts in History. Her research involves investigating the use of natural language processing techniques on historical war diaries. And so with that, I'd like to invite Ashley to share her screen and we'll hand over to her for her presentation. Thank you.
In history, and my PhD is actually an extension of my work that I did in Masters, and this is focusing on the use of analysing Australian World War I diaries using mathematical and computational techniques. So I'm just going to give you some background why I started this project, go through my results from my Masters, and then what I'm hoping to do in PhD. So initially this work was suggested to me by my supervisor. He'd found that the State Library of New South Wales had recently digitised their entire World War I collection. This was great. It meant we had this source of text which we could analyse, and we wanted to see what we could do with it. So in Masters, the main aim was to analyse these World War I diaries using mathematical and computational techniques to work out what the soldiers were writing about and how they felt over the course of the war. We weren't looking for a specific answer to a question. It was more sort of what could we do with these techniques. So the corpus, as I said, is from the State Library of New South Wales. There's a total of 966 documents. 557 of those were labelled as diaries. And that's over 9 million words, which is quite a large data set. Now, this data set has been analysed through the traditional technique of closely reading diaries before. But in that case, they only actually looked at 20 diaries because to read this many diaries, this many words would take a very long time. So in my Masters, there were several things I did, and the first two were data cleaning and date extraction. And this actually takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to get right. Mainly if your data is not in a certain format, the computer struggles and misses things and that sort of thing. And date extraction is very important. As I said, we're looking at diaries. So if we know what dates the entries were written on, we can actually do our analysis over time and map what happened over the course of the war. So then the two main things I did some topic analysis. So what were they writing about? So I will go through some of this, the word frequencies and topic modelling. I also did some TF-IDF analysis. I won't touch on that today though. And then I did some sentiment analysis, and sentiment analysis is looking at the emotions they had in the text. So start off with word frequencies. So this is the top 100 most frequent words from the diaries. It is excluding words like and, to, or, because those don't tell us much. And the interesting thing is when I looked at this, all the words in the middle, those really frequent words, they were times of day, you know, night, day, afternoon, morning. There was some weather words, cold, words about, you know, eating, where they were, how they were traveling, writing letters, that sort of thing. All these really common words. And then we sort of have this layer of words that are more war-related, some of them. So the ones in green here are all words that are really war-related. So you've got, you know, wounded, guns, trench, that sort of thing. We also have what I call homonyms. So these are words that could have a meaning specific to war, if in that context, but usually you wouldn't think that. So for instance, here we have horse, and I believe light is here as well. So light horse is a type of battalion they had in World War I, but those two words by themselves don't mean much outside of that context. So for me, it was really interesting seeing that, you know, these times of day were actually the most frequent words. So we then looked at topic modelling. So topic modelling is based on this idea that every document's created of a series of topics, and those topics are made up of a list of words. So if you considered the sentence, the cat is happy but the dog is sad, you might have two topics of animals and emotions. And so based on this idea, you can actually work backwards, and given a document, you could find the topics and the list of words in those topics, and to sort of track what the document is about that way. So we were able to do this, and based on some analysis, we found that 10 topics was the best amount of topics to look for. And so we used an algorithm called LDA, and it automatically split it up into 10 topics. And then we plotted the proportion of these topics over time. And this is what I'm showing here. And because I can't really show you the list of words, I've given each of the topics a name. So for instance, the war at sea topic, it has a lot of words about boats, ships. It also has a lot of words regarding the sinking of the Emden. That was the first battle Australia was involved in World War I. The Egypt topic has a lot of words like pyramids, Cairo, Alexandria, camel, that sort of thing. So the good thing about this is it matches what we expect in World War I. At the start, there's a lot of talk of being on boats and the sinking of the Emden. Then they have these peak for the Egypt when they're there training. Then a huge peak for Gallipoli. Obviously, that was one of our first major battles. Then back to Egypt. Then we have these, what I've called trenches. These three topics, there wasn't much differentiating them, aside from just the place names they mentioned in them. This is when they were battling on the Western Front and in the Middle East. Then we see the armistice topic. They're talking about the wars being over, they're starting to go home. And then this home again topic, they've got a lot of words like aunt and mum and dad and shopping, all these things that happen after they've gone home. The really interesting thing for me here is this everyday life topic. So these are similar to the word frequencies, those words just about time of day and all these really common things. And they're actually talking about this for most of the war. Over 60% of what they were writing was about just their everyday activities. I found this quite interesting. I expected them to talk more about, you know, the war, the battles, what was happening. And in reality, they actually primarily talked about their day-to-day lives. So the next thing I looked at was sentiment analysis. So as I said before, sentiment analysis is looking at the emotions in the text, sort of the attitudes of the writer towards their attitude towards what they're writing about. And so we're classifying text as positive, negative, or neutral. And we do this during dictionary-based methods. So there's a few different types of sentiment analysis techniques, and dictionary-based methods is a really simple one, where you get a dictionary of words and someone has already gone along and rated them as positive, negative, or neutral. So words like good and excellent and wonderful might have a positive sentiment. Bad, terrible, awful would have negative. Other words obviously words like and that, but even some other words would have neutral sentiment. And so you compare that to find an average for what your text is. And so I did that using 8 different dictionaries. And the reason I use different dictionaries is the fact that your dictionaries, how good they are, depends on what topic you're using them on and how different in the time changes, because obviously as you go further in time, words change meanings, new words are created, words disappear. But the good thing is, using these 8, I did find that there was this common pattern, which we can also see when we look at the average, which is the black dotted line. We did have a bit of variation after January 1920 and before August 1914. That was simply due to a lack of data. There was only 1 or 2 diarists for those times, so without enough data, the sentiment looks very varied. So this was great. I saw some small peaks in that. It's primarily a neutral sentiment, like just above neutral, but there are peaks and dips in it. So I wanted to know what those were about. So I then compared the average sentiment with my topics. So here, the black dotted line is the average sentiment. And I've excluded those times when there was very few diarists. I've also included the everyday life and home again topics because they were talked about so much, they won't really give us any information about the peaks and dips in sentiment. So this was interesting. A lot of it matched up to what we expect. When they're in Egypt, they're like looking around the pyramids, they're training, it's a lot more positive. In the Gallipoli timeframe, the sentiment drops, as to be expected. After the armistice is declared, the sentiment rises. The one that's interesting for me is there's actually a dip in sentiment corresponding to a peak in the White Christmas topic. So this White Christmas topic was talking about the cold weather, it's talking about Christmas. When you actually look at it, you see a lot of very negative entries about, mud and slush and how horrible the trenches are. And you also see a few entries about, Christmas, they're stuck on the front lines in this horrid weather. They've got no food, no rations, no Red Cross packages. So that's why we actually see this dip in sentiment. I personally found that quite interesting because we usually think of Christmas as such a positive thing. But in this case, because they're on the front lines in this weather, it was actually quite negative. So that was the end of my master's. So I'm now going into PhD and I've got some new research questions. So my first is, how accurate are these sentiment analysis techniques on historic data? So as I said, how accurate those dictionaries are is based on when the dictionary was created, whether like the words are actually based on the topic you're looking at. So for instance, in tennis, the word love is actually quite negative because it means you've got no points. But outside of tennis, love is actually quite a positive word. So whether these words have positive or negative sentiment actually depends on what domain they're looked at. So I want to look at current sentiment analysis techniques on historic data and try and find a really good sentiment technique that's accurate and easy to apply. Because as we get more and more of this historic data or even other humanities data in this text format that computers can read, this means if we have a simple, easy way to apply an accurate sentiment technique, we can actually use this more to try and find out more information about those documents. The other thing I want to look at is how World War I was portrayed differently in newspapers and diaries. So I've looked at these diaries and I've already been surprised by the fact that they talk about their everyday life quite often. But I want to look into actually how different was the newspaper, how different was what the public were being told about the war. And hopefully through sentiment, was the war portrayed in the newspapers really positive as compared to the diaries or vice versa? And also just whether we can use techniques like topic modelling and sentiment analysis to contribute to any debates about World War I or any questions that are sort of out in the open, not really answered, why did they enlist, that sort of thing. So thank you for listening. As Alexa says, if you have any questions, pop them in the chat and hopefully we'll be able to answer those later.
Thanks so much, Ashley. That was really interesting. Yeah, and feel free to put any questions that you might have in that chat window, and at the end of the session, we'll pose them to Ashley. So coming up next, we've got Rachel A. Ankeny, a Professor of History and Philosophy at the University of Adelaide, an Honorary Visiting Professor at the College of Social Science and International Studies, philosophy at the University of Exeter in the UK. She plays a significant role in international bodies dedicated to the history, philosophy, and social studies of sciences. And quite recently, her team has received a significant grant from the Medical Research Future Fund to use interdisciplinary evidence-based approaches to consider community trust in stem cell-based research and therapies. Her research covers several fields, including food studies, history and philosophy of the biological and biomedical sciences, and bioethics. And she uses a variety of textual analysis methods for several of her ongoing projects. And with that, I will hand over to Rachel. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alexis. Hopefully you can now see this. I realize the talk that I'm going to give today is somewhat about text, but I mean, I think in some way it does illustrate the problems with different kinds of text and what work text can do for us in the humanities. So be patient, because I do think in the end the questions are directly relevant. So this project comes out of a joint project with colleagues based at the institutions that you see below, including a philosopher historian like me, Mark McPeak, who is a ecological scientist, and Aisha Duong, who is a undergraduate at University of Adelaide, who has been really fundamental to a lot of the legwork, as you'll see in a minute. What we're interested in, there's an issue in the history and philosophy of science which also affects science policy and even science practice, which is how do scientists choose which organisms to study? And how do those choices make a difference to what we come to learn and know from their research? Sorry, I didn't mean to do that quite yet. There's been a claim, particularly among scientists, but somewhat taken up by some philosophers and others, that model organisms, so-called model organisms, which are down the left, have swamped out kind of the agenda, but also the representation of what scientists study. And so down the left, you see some of the model organisms that were sort of chosen as part of the Human Genome Projects. The idea being you could study these, but then the results would be applicable up and down the animal kingdom and including to humans. The problem here is that this is an empirical question, and we actually don't have good evidence about whether or not there has been this kind of swamping, what people are studying and why they're studying them. Let alone do we understand why they're making the choices that they make. And so this is an overarching question for the general ARC project, Organisms in Us, that I head up, but we specifically wanted to study this not just in qualitative ways or traditional historical ways, but also quantitative ways. Traditionally in history of biology, people have tended to do counts of, say, use of a single organism. I've done one myself, so have some of our other collaborators, but it doesn't give us enough comparative material. So we set out to try and answer the following questions in a more quantitative way. Is it the case that model organism research has excluded consideration of other organisms? How has this changed or altered since the 1970s, and what factors have affected it at various points in the history? And then more generally, what is the value of biological diversity in this sort of research? How is it viewed? How is it understood? How is it enacted by scientists? And so how did we do this? We decided to pick journals that were representative of various fields, as you can see down the left, and sample them in 5-year intervals. So go ahead and look at everything in a given year that was published. Focus on research articles, so eliminate anything that wasn't a research article, and then look at discussions of our research articles that focused on using particular organisms or more than one organism. So you can see this is a huge number of articles. That's already difficult enough. You can access these basically automatically, but then you have to actually do a lot of it by hand, as I'll show you in a minute. So the numbers are quite big. You can already start to see we're making some assumptions also in our sampling strategy. So to do this, what we did, and we did this with the, I keep doing that. We did this with the help of undergraduate students and others, is actually read, score, and code all of the articles in that sample. And so you see in the backdrop kind of the spreadsheet that we start with, then we go through and come up with what was a particular article about, which organism did it focus on, and then transcribe that data into these huge Excel spreadsheets. And you can see here the foreground slide sort of shows you where we have conventional model organisms like fruit flies and mice. And then the backdrop, you start to see a bigger diversity of things that are being studied, including lots of Latin names you probably don't recognize. So a couple things that can easily go wrong here. One, if you have a misspelling, it's fatal. And so, you know, because they're Latin names, you need to be able to recognize them. Two, names of organisms change over time. So in the early part of the study, sometimes the name would be different, but it would actually be the same organism later. Three, some articles don't even tell you what they're studying. So it does take a little bit of knowledge of the field to figure out by default, it's a mouse study, or it's a rat study, or it's a human study. So we tended to employ undergraduates who had experience in one or more of the sciences because they needed to, biomedical sciences, biological sciences, they needed to be able to read between the lines. So huge effort. Then what do we do with it? Here on this slide, what you see is a tracking of the way in which from 1975 to 2015 in each case, you had changes in the numbers of kinds of organisms used and so on and so on. The orange is, sorry, I'm having trouble seeing my own slides. The one line is model and the other line is non-model. And you can see already the claim, generic claim, that it is the case that there's privileging of certain things and a deprivileging of other things is not the case. It really doesn't matter, perhaps obviously, what field you're working in. And this is the data that we got out of this. So then we tried a few more sort of techniques, and I'll try and take you through those very quickly. In general, what we see is, again, not surprising, but we didn't have this data, relatively static kinds of trends about use in fields that were focused on population or ecosystems. They tend to use a bigger variety of organisms, and an increase in using these model organisms for basic research based on the so-called presumption of generality, which I'll talk about in a minute. How do we use this data? Well, we use it as a way in. This isn't going to be the whole story, but it does give us a way into starting to ask questions, for example, where there are changes in those peaks and troughs. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. So one of the things that we got interested in was this presumption of generality. The kind of classic quote was, what is true for E. coli is true, bacteria is true for the elephant, right? So you can study yeast, you can study E. coli, you can study anything, a mouse, and it'll tell you about elephants or humans. And this came to be kind of an assumption that wasn't fleshed out adequately. But again, an open question in our field is this true? Part of the problem is many of these things are lab-based, and therefore they're highly refined organisms. They don't match what's out there in nature. But even more to the point, how do we know that these things are actually representative? So that's why I term it presumption of generality. So when we then try and answer these kinds of questions, we did a number of different kinds of mapping. And here's where using different kinds of programs that biologists commonly use, but others commonly use, both stats programs, but others, simply mapping the statistics. We're in the process of doing a much more rich phylogenetic mapping to see how the organisms are spaced out in terms of the tree of life. But what you see here is there's obviously differences that we can control for to a certain extent, depending on the number of articles. And again, the fields differ quite significantly. Species richness gives us one measure. It's a way of looking at one measure. And when you look at this, if we're going to ask, for example, was there a big change once we started wondering about using other organisms to understand humans or the translational trend, we want to look at patterns in that period starting in the mid-90s into the mid-2000s. And so that's the arrow. So this kind of data gives us a probe in to try and see, well, what is the pattern? And then think about how we can use other types of tools, perhaps more conventional ones, to look at why that might have been the case and what was driving it. Another way of thinking about this kind of diversity problem is to do what's called a rank abundance curve analysis. Here, I've got the Journal of Physiology. And what we see, we're going from the earliest years up through 2015. You have some pretty big differences, but it points more generally to a decline in species richness across organisms like frog and rat and so on. But we also see humans remain the dominant species pretty much throughout, at least in physiology. So another view from physiology, we see a crash actually in terms of non-model organisms. And so they're, perhaps not surprisingly, because they're interested in biomedical type issues, they're going to be using models, things that explicitly are going to be applicable to the human or are thought to be. And so then we use all sorts of, I'm not going to go into the details, but other metrics to try to see what we can kind of plow out of this rich data. Here we have 4 of the journals representing the fields against each other. And you can see, depending on whether we pick richness or diversity or dominance, which organism is the most popular as a measure, we see different sorts of problems. And in some way, answering the questions we want to answer is at the intersection or the overlay of these different kinds of metrics that we're able to generate out of our data. So some general conclusions so far, biological diversity is necessary and valued if the object is in fact biological diversity, such as an ecology, but also things like if it's a multi-species system, if the object of study is comparative, and so on. And you can see that in the data from the journal Ecology representing the field of ecology. But biological diversity is more limited if you're looking to translate to humans or more generally, where model organisms are the dominant choice, or where it seems this presumption of generality tends to take hold. And in the red, you have cell biology being compared to ecology, and you can really see the difference there. So just a final example, molecular biology, represented by Journal of Molecular Biology. You can see E. coli has tended to dominate, but we also see sort of this period where people got super interested in using molecular techniques to look at humans. And again, they are depending which metric you use, you see different sorts of patterns. So where is this going to take us? We had previously done an article that you see on the left, part of the overlapping research group, that looked at various criteria that scientists talk about in their publications, in oral history interviews that we do, in their biographies, in their own writing about their own histories, things they talk about, and this was the long list of sorts of things that they consider. This in part was to counter a typical thing in philosophy of science that tends to say, well, what really matters is what's going to do the most work for you, what's going to get you the most knowledge. A big theme that we've said is, yeah, that's part of the picture, but there's all sorts of other things. You may not study sharks because they're actually risky to study in various ways. And you can't get access to the phenomena that you might want to study. Things are standardized, and that's sometimes useful. In other cases, standardization is a bad thing, and so on and so on and so on. So you can see we have a number of things in the mix that go well beyond the just studying what you think is going to be most, produce the most knowledge or answer your questions most clearly. And so the next steps for us are in some way to combine this more qualitative take on the left with this quantitative take that we've developed to look at questions ranging from, well, how can we get evidence at various points in this data about what were the grounds for choice and why do things take off or become unpopular when we start at data at this kind of scale, up in this kind of scale of a very relatively long time period and a huge amount of data points. How can we reconcile these kind of individual choice stories that we have a lot of with these major trends in the field that we think we get a window into through publications? What do we learn by sampling and coding articles in terms of key themes? That's the next thing we're going to do. We think we're going to have to do that by hand. So yet again, sample and look at, what are the sorts of things they're doing? Are they saying this is translation or this is basic research? We would like to think about using machine learning techniques to automate that. But our experience, even in just finding the names of the organisms being difficult, makes us skeptical. And hence, we're thinking we're going to need to use much more social science, textual analysis kinds of techniques. But I would love if there's anyone out there who thinks they've got some machine learning techniques to get in touch. And finally, then how do we accrete up to our general research questions? This is just data. What we really want to know is what happened historically in these fields. Is there this assumption? And in particular, how can we get evidence of an assumption that's implicit? And so when we look at then how this shaped the way in which knowledge was created, we're going to need to go up yet again and find explanatory and causal factors that go beyond the data itself to give us a window into these practices. So that's just a snapshot, but I hope it gives you a sense of it, even if you don't understand the details necessarily of the data. So I just want to acknowledge the ARC funding we got for this project. and a large amount of research assistance from a team of undergraduate students who assisted with the coding. You can imagine 25,000 entries. So it took several years effectively to do this. We've done this on a smaller scale in the past, and we knew it would work, but a lot of data cleaning, a lot of just sheer slog. I think, in many ways, we might think that we'll be able to avoid this sort of thing in the future, but anytime we're doing historical work, as we heard in the last talk, we necessarily are dealing with documents that happened in the past. And so no amount of sort of putting them online solves the fact that, in fact, they're written using the norms of the past. They're written using the language of the past. They're written assuming the people who are going to read them are going to know what they're talking about. And so I think this has been a good lesson. We knew it already, but the amount of articles that literally didn't say what they were working on was a really good wake-up call about needing to be really careful when you deal with automated harvesting techniques or data scraping in historical domains. So that's it. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you so much. There was a lot in that. I'm really, it was really good. And I love to see already between Ashley's work and Rachel's work, just seeing both the mix of quantitative and qualitative techniques that are necessary to really understand it, and also the use of text analysis as a tool for sort of a way in and not being the whole story itself. And I like your reference of needing the expertise from the field in order to understand these things. I hope there's a lesson in there for biologists as well, to just name your organism in the future too.
Well, yeah, but the people they're talking to know what they're talking about. Yeah. So why do they need to do that? They're not writing. Anyway, you get the idea. Yeah. They may be forced into that now because of the way in which things are indexed in Web of Science and Clarivate, whatever. So there's another research study as well, is how these things change over time too. So thank you so much for that. So for our final presentation today, we've got Dr. Martin Schweinberger from the University of Queensland School of Languages and Culture. And Martin has a background in English linguistics with a focus on computational processing and statistical modelling of language data. His research focuses on language variation and change, language acquisition and reproducibility in the language sciences. In his current role, he's the co-director and main contributor to the Language, Technology and Data Analytics Lab, as well as a key collaborator on the establishment of the Australian Text Analytics platform. Now, Martin shares his time between the University of Queensland and the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø, and is presently in Europe. So he's kindly pre-recorded his talk for us, but his colleague, Professor Michael Haugh, is here to participate in discussion after the event. Thanks so much for joining us, Michael. He's a professor of linguistics and applied linguistics at that same School of Languages and Culture, and his research spans pragmatics, intercultural communication and humour studies. And he's a leading proponent of the Australian Text Analytics platform, the Language, Technology and Data Analytics Lab, and the Language Data Commons of Australia. So thank you for making time to join us today, Michael. So I will share my screen so that I can play Martin's presentation. And then after that, I will bring all of our speakers back, hopefully, to answer some of your questions. Please feel free to continue putting those in the chat window.
Hello, my name is Martin Schweinberger, and together with Michael Haugh, we are going to present the Language Technology and Data Analysis Laboratory, LADAL, and the Australian Text Analytics Platform, ATAP. First off, we'd like to give you some background on why we think it's important to build an infrastructure for computational humanities. I think we can all agree that the computational revolution has changed and affected all domains of life, but at the same time, HAS programs have remained rather traditional. And while they've integrated some computational skills, we think that the efforts to integrate computational skills in curricula have to be extended. And if we do not do that, there will continue to be a disconnect between the economic and societal needs for computational skills and the supply within HAS education. Now, that is particularly saddening because we think that there's a huge potential by extending computational methods to humanities research. For example, by using computational skills, we can tap into big data and multimodal resources, which means that we can tap into amounts and types of data that we have never been able to tap into before. At the same time, we can create real-world applications that can be used in language learning or machine translation or speech recognition, for example. And these real-world applications exist, but they rarely come out of the humanities. But we think that actually the humanities can play a bigger role in providing these real-world applications, because we're in the ground and we have expertise in working with textual data that IT people do not have to the extent that humanities researchers have. In addition, by using computational methods, we can improve the transparency and reproducibility of research, which is good, especially in the light of the ongoing replication crises, where we see that there's a need to really make available what we do and show exactly what we've done to colleagues, but also the wider public. Now, unfortunately, there are limited broad range resources for Haugh researchers that show them how to apply computational methods to textual data on humanities topics, and that in a transparent manner. So the resources just are not there. Now, there are three main problems when we want to build computational resources for Haugh researchers. First, the people that we're dealing with, so the researchers and students, they differ quite dramatically in their levels of expertise. So you have people who have very little experience and skills in computational methods or digital resources. Then we are talking to very different audiences. So, for example, the needs for that literary scholars have is very different from sociologists or linguists. And that means that we'll have to basically supply methods that are relevant for a broad range of disciplines. And we think that there are three components when we want to build computational humanities resources, namely generic training, like introductions to R, for example, or data visualization that can be offered by the libraries. Then more specialized training, that is what the LADAL offers. It's training on very basic, but also more sophisticated methods and tools. But it's more like just basically you can read up on the methods and then copy and paste code. So the ATAP basically brings another aspect into the game, which is basically a cloud-based service that allows researchers to perform analysis on the web, independent of their computer, in an interactive manner. Just a little bit of information about LADAL. So the LADAL is an e-research support infrastructure for computational humanities that was established and is maintained by the UQ School of Languages and Cultures. The LADAL enables the development of skills in digital tools and data management, so ranging from very basic stuff like file naming, how to order your projects and folders, and how to avoid data loss, to the use of computational methods and also training in basic programming skills. When you look at the tutorials that we offer, they focus on basically how to extract data from textual data. So how to extract, for example, the occurrences of certain words or phrases, and how to transform and process that data, but also how to visualize the data. Data visualization is really, really important. And we offer a multitude of different ways to show your data to the public, including, for example, also geospatial mapping, but also interactive web apps. So it's quite a broad range of data visualization techniques that we offer. And finally, it's of course natural language processing and text analytics. Again, different methods like sentiment analysis, topic modeling, network analysis, but also various statistical procedures, including classification, machine learning, but also mixed effects regression modeling. So something that's very relevant for research. The services that we offer are, on the one hand, self-guided study materials, so online materials that you can read through and then copy the code that's presented and basically copy that code into your own on your own computer and run it yourself. And the topics, as I said, range from data extraction, processing to data visualization, data analysis, text analytics. So it's essentially an effort for learning to code. And then we also offer face-to-face consultations if people have a particular topic in mind, and then we can consult with them which methods are appropriate to use to analyze the data. And finally, we offer workshops on how to use the methods and resources that we offer by LADAL. And what you see here is some examples from the LADAL tutorials. And you see that, for example, we use word clouds, very simple visualizations of data, to geospatial mapping, over to tree-based statistical methods. Here you see the result of a barometer in the box plots. That's a very recent tree-based statistical method that is now becoming more and more prominent in machine learning and classification. You see that we actually have tutorials on how to deal with liquid data, but also regression modeling, as you see here in the scatter plots with the lines in there. What we hope to achieve is we hope to improve the quality of research by showing people how to implement certain procedures following best practices, and also to make their research just reproducible and replicable. And that makes that allows researchers to make use of digital methods using big data, right? It also enables researchers to pursue new pathways by using innovative methods and new types of data. So, for example, social media data and machine learning techniques. We also want to improve the data management skills of people, so that their workflows are tidier, more transparent, and more efficient. Of course, if you know how to handle your data, it will make it much easier for you to perform analysis. And finally, we really just want to provide an infrastructure for acquiring computational skills. So it's really like basic programming for humanities researchers by showing them how to implement things that would help them in their own research. And what you see here on the right are the in the bar graph are the results of topic modeling based on the State of the Union addresses of US presidents over time. And you see that the topics have changed over time. So some topics that were more prominent in the early days basically become less important, and other topics that were more important in the beginning actually become less important over time. And you can basically see that here in the bar graph and how much space the different sections of the bar plots take. The Australian Text Analytics platform, ATAP, brings together users and providers of text analytics in an integrated collaborative cloud-based environment. And that means that while the LADAL tutorials basically just show you how these methods can be used, and you can copy and paste code, here you have the ATAP is supposed to basically provide an environment in which you can really perform these analysis in the cloud. So independent of your computer, and it's interactive, meaning you can really either use data that's already there, or you can upload your own data and then perform text analytics on that data in the cloud. And in addition to providing these services, also ATAP will provide training resources on how to use text analytics. So it's not just the service themselves, but also training on how to use it. That means that ATAP will increase the accessibility, the transparency, and the replicability in the use of text analytics in Australian research. So that means that ATAP will enable Australian researchers in the humanities, social sciences, and other disciplines to increase their capacity to use text analytics. Now, we've talked about text analytics, but we haven't defined it so far. So text analytics means that you use computational means to extract information from unstructured textual data. Now, computational tools in text analytics include natural language processing, data analytics, and machine learning. And information that is extracted from texts is typically, well, we use exploratory and data-driven methods. And the most prominent methods, we have a range of methods, but the most prominent ones are topic modeling, sentiment analysis, and network analysis. Now, I've shown you the results of topic modeling here. And what you see here in the top right is a network analysis of the personas in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. And the bigger the name is, the more often it occurs. And the stronger the connection, the more often these personas occur together. The lower graph here shows a bar graph which represents the results of a sentiment analysis of selected literary works, for example, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, or George Orwell's 1984, and you see how often words are used in those different works of fiction relating to anger, fear, joy, anticipation, or trust. And so you can basically see that just by looking at the words, these different works have different profiles. Now, the differences between text analytics and traditional content and discourse analysis are that TA uses and is applied to larger amounts of data. Typically, traditional approaches use a single work of fiction, for example, and with text analytics, you can apply to 10, hundreds, or even thousands of literary works. The data processing in text analytics is performed mostly using computational means rather than manual annotation. And also we use machine learning and statistical methods rather than manual post-editing. Information extraction is based on exploratory and data-driven methods, again, rather than manual annotation. And in text analytics, aspects of data science, so data management, reproducibility, receive a much stronger focus. And that means that the advantages of text analytics are that they offer reproducible, intersubjective ways to detect patterns and trends in large amounts of data that could not be detected by traditional means. So it's not basically replacing traditional analyses, but they basically offer new ways of looking at data, perspectives that could not be taken in without taking computational means. Here's a case study that was performed by myself, Michael Haugh, and Sam Haynes, and we analysed the COVID discourse in the Australian Twitter sphere. The case study is published in Big Data and Society. Our aim was to understand the development and emotional shifts in the discourse around COVID-19 in the Australian Twitter sphere. And there was a problem because those people who understand discourse, they mostly used qualitative analyses on very small amounts of data, whereas those people who understood how to use big data analytics, they didn't really understand discourse, and they just used or looked at the COVID discourse as one giant lump of text. And as humanities researchers, we know that when you want to really understand discourse, you need to break it down. And so we wanted to find out about what different phases did the discourse go through, and what different sub-discourses make up the discourse around COVID. And what you see on the right here is that initially you have a phase where there weren't that many tweets about COVID. That was the phase when COVID was still abroad. It was mostly in China. That's the first phase. And then when COVID entered Australia, then you see that the number of tweets about COVID increased quite dramatically, with a peak during the first restrictions and lockdowns. And we determined these different phases by looking at the frequency of keywords. And then we performed clustering, and the result of clustering can be seen here in that circle graph. Now, the advantages of using a text analytics approach was that we could combine sophisticated computational methods with linguistically informed understanding of discourse. So it's very important that we don't leave this just to computer scientists, but that we as humanities researchers basically make use of what we're good at, which is to understand language and discourse. And the outcome of the study was that the discourse evolved in 7 phases and consisted out of 5 main sub-discourses: the medical discourse, an international discourse that focused on what's going on abroad, a discourse that focused on the restrictions and what was going on at home, a discourse that really focused on how COVID spread, and then a discourse on how basically the economy was affected by COVID and by the restrictions. Now, what was interesting about the discourse was that the discourse was very negative when COVID entered Australia, but then basically it soon recovered, and people really showed that they thought or were thinking that we'll be able to deal with COVID. And they were very positive in their attitude. And the only topic that remained very negative was actually the topic about the spread of COVID, and that is quite natural, right? But so you see that the emotional shifts should be analyzed topic specifically. So they should be analyzed separately for each topic, which is what we did. So this was basically a presentation about LADAL and ATAP, and it provided one case study showing how text analytics can be used in the humanities. Thank you so very much, and you can access the slides through Alexis. We'll share the slides with her, and so she can make them available to you. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Bye.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that for me, Karen, and making up for our technical difficulties there. I'd like to invite all of our speakers to please turn their cameras back on, and we'll have a bit of time for discussion. So yeah, that was, I think, actually 3 really interesting case studies of text analysis across some really different fields, but I love to see certain parallels coming through there about bringing together traditional forms of expertise, or not traditional, you know, our disciplinary forms of expertise together with these computational methods. It was really nice, a nice set of parallels in those presentations, I thought. We did have a couple of questions come in for Ashley, actually, and I might see if we could bundle them together. We had a question about perhaps an inquiry about what packages and methods you are using in your work, Ashley, but also a question, Jennifer Clark has asked a question about noting that you have this mathematical background and you're studying history as well, and thinking about if you have any comments to make about how your history study has affected your mathematical approaches or vice versa in that context.
Yeah, so as for the first question, I use a variety of packages, mainly in R, though there are also packages in Python. Can't remember them off the top of my head, but I know a lot of these things, the topic modeling and a lot of the sentiment analysis dictionaries already have code written up. So I've been using the relevant packages for those. As for studying history and maths, the reason I'm actually studying history is because I got to the end of my master's and I realised that I had all this great work in the maths and computer science. I could pick out points on the graphs where things changed, but I actually couldn't relate that back historically as good as I'd like to. So I started doing this diploma, and it's really opened my eyes to a different way of thinking. So in maths, it's very straightforward. You know, there's a certain definition for a square, a different definition for a triangle. You know, there is a solution for X, that sort of thing. In history, it's much more open, I found. You have discussions. There's no one right answer. One of my first classes was looking at revolutions. There wasn't even a straightforward definition for that. So I think I've really have an advantage in both areas, that this maths thinking allows me to think a little logically in the history, but also this experience in looking at history in different ways and debating it and looking from different perspectives. It's really helping me in my research to actually not just be straightforward, but to look at the different ways, to look at how we can now do our analysis different, what we could combine, other sources, and also how other people might view it in respect to different types of arguments.
Thanks, Ashley. Did any of the panelists have any questions for each other? Good. I see, Rachel, that you have responded to Matilda's question, but perhaps just for the sake of the video, Matilda has asked you if you thought about the influence of the peer review and editorial process and journal selection in the organism selection you've analysed.
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, you know, it's the truism, you know, the results are only going to be good as the data in. So what we're not studying is things that got rejected or didn't get put in the mix. And so we know there are undoubtedly gaps of things that were either unpopular or unproven or sort of died off in terms of foci of study. We do think, I mean, there's the sort of background of methods that I didn't talk about that relates to how we chose the journals and why we think they're representative of their fields. And in that sense, I'm not worried about the influence of peer review and editorial process, because that's part of how the field defines itself. So it's actually a positive thing that in some sense there's a unity or a consistency in the types of things they represent or they accept, because then that comes to represent the field. So that's why we think journals are at least good for making the positive case about what's out there. What we can't make is any kind of negative case about what falls flat. Right.
Didn't get chosen. Yeah, for sure. Michael, we've had an inquiry there about the Australian Text Analytics platform and LADAL, and if there are ways for researchers to contribute or be involved in the development, and also what involvement there can be for people outside of Brisbane.
Absolutely. So we have a weekly webinar series for LADAL, It's often on a Thursday, sometimes on a Monday. But if you go to the LADAL website, you can actually see the events there. We've recorded all of them because we know sometimes it's not easy to get to the webinar, and we're putting them up on the LADAL YouTube channel. So if you see some that you're interested in, we're progressively putting them up. It's quite a good series of different researchers working in all kinds of disciplines with text analytics and the humanities. So it's a good chance to hear from people who are working, at the cutting edge of this stuff. So we definitely, that's one way to get involved. We have just recruited our communications and engagement officer. So we're working on how to do the outreach to everyone in the country and get you all involved. So that's watch this space kind of thing. But we definitely want to get as many researchers involved as we can in the project.
Right. And I'm the Manager of Digital Innovation here at the University of Adelaide Library. So for people who are here from our community, if you're interested in learning more about these, you can always talk to me about it. Now, we have run slightly over time, and I might just have a little closing question. If anybody from the group wants to volunteer a short answer to the question about how to learn more about these data analysis methods for a person who's trained in historical research and has no background in computational analytics or mathematics, any quick tips from the panel we've got here?
Don't learn them, collaborate with someone, because there's people who are eager to find interesting material to work on. You don't have to do everything. And so we typically have no problem finding people who are willing to collaborate and get a joint publication out or whatever else. You might do it on a trial run and then, play it out into your bigger thesis or something. I mean, it's harder when you're doing a thesis or whatever else. I do understand that. But collaboration, that's what I would suggest.
On that note, I know a lot of people in the maths department are very keen on collaborations with humanities people. So definitely, if you're not sure about learning it, contact someone, because there is probably someone who's willing to collaborate and help you out.
And perhaps I'd just add, I think attending these kind of webinars and taking a look at things like the LADAL website helps you learn the language. So I agree, collaborating is good, but you need to know how to talk with your colleagues in the computer science departments and so on. So learning the language and what topic modeling means and so on is a great way. Even if you're not going to be doing it yourself, you need to understand what it involves.
Yeah, I would absolutely reinforce that as well, Michael. I agree. Collaboration is a fabulous way to go, but a little bit of dabbling your fingers in it, a little bit of being aware and listening to these things can help you think critically about these approaches and communicate more effectively with those collaborators. With that, we have gone over time. I really appreciate these excellent, interesting presentations from our speakers today. I'd like to thank them very much. I'd also like to give special thanks to Karen, our producer, especially for her technical assistance where things happened during the course of that webinar. I will send you all an email about the next webinar, which will be about tech network analysis. And this video will be available on the University of Adelaide YouTube page shortly. Okay, thank you very much for joining us today. Have a lovely afternoon wherever you are. Bye.